Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Ask Beverly. We've got Beverly Palmer with us. Good afternoon, Beverly. How are you?
I'm doing fine. It's a beautiful day.
It
Lovely
is a
spring
beautiful
day.
day.
Yeah.
Yes, spring has sprung, and we're here in March. And for those of you all who are just joining us for the first time, or if you're back, welcome and welcome back. This month is March, and it is Women's History Month. And as you all know, our Ask Beverly series is all about Senator Charles Sumner, who is the namesake of our building, the Charles Sumner School Museum and Archives. So we have been spending some time emphasizing various aspects of his legacy and the history about Senator Sumner. And this month, because it's Women's History Month, I was very curious about something. And I wanted to bring in Beverly again for our audience and have a discussion regarding Senator Sumner and his viewpoints and perspectives and attitudes about women's rights, and also his relationship with women. So I guess I'll fire off my questions. Beverly, are you ready?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. So of course, we've talked a lot about Senator Sumner and his civil rights advocacy, really geared towards equality for African Americans here in this country. But I guess I want to just kick it off. And what do we know about Senator Sumner's attitudes around women's rights?
Well, he was not unlike a lot of the reformers, male reformers, in the years leading up to the Civil War. He was conversant with all the activities that were going on, and what was uniting all the reformers before the Civil War, this is quite obvious, is the anti-slavery. And so this was going on. There were just a few men who really joined the women's rights meetings, and I have all the documentation for that because we edited the speeches of Lucretia Mott. And so you can look in there and see the various men who were involved, and you don't see very many, and you don't see Sumner. Frederick Douglass was one who was involved, Wendell Phillips, Lucretia Mott's husband was quite involved, sort of a silent partner. He didn't say much, but was very supportive. And sometimes in the early days, for example, Seneca Falls, they asked James Mott to chair the meeting because they just wondered if they should have a woman running the meeting as they got more, you might say, braver or just more aggressive. And then he kind of stepped back, and Lucretia often chaired some of those meetings. So you see Douglass and Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison involved, but not Sumner and not most of the anti-slavery members of Congress either involved in that. And so then after the Civil War, this is where things came to a division, because everyone agreed that the 13th Amendment freeing the slaves should be passed and supported that. Sumner, of course, ardently. And then the 14th Amendment giving civil rights and equal rights to all Blacks. The crux came when the 15th Amendment came, and that was going to give male Blacks the right to vote. Right. And this is where some of the women disagreed, some of them quite strongly. And so there was this rift. And at this point, Sumner was very, very ardent about giving the male Blacks to vote, and sort of wobbled on this. And many of the women, including Stanton and Anthony, broke with some people, including Sumner and some of the others, over this, because they thought that women should get to vote and there should be an amendment that would include women. And some people, including Douglass, for one, who said, no, I think he was the one who said, this is the Negro's hour. Let us get this male vote through the amendment. And so there was quite a bit of difference. And this was played out in various meetings. Lucretia Mott was often you might say, a go-between or trying to make peace with the Stanton and Anthony group and the others who just said, no, we want just male blacks. She signed several articles supporting the 15th Amendment. And it's kind of interesting. There's one letter that was in the Lucretia Mott letters where she, and let me think, I think there's 2 other blacks, 3 other women, and 4 white men addressed a petition to fellow abolitionists and endorsing the 15th Amendment. And that was in December 1869, and in 1870, the amendment was adopted by Congress and became part of the Constitution. So anyway, that's kind of tells you where Sumner and many, many other men who were reformers stood after the 15th Amendment. Then many of these women's rights leaders would invite Sumner because of his oratory and because he was so strongly in favor of equal rights to some of their meetings. And so I can just read one letter that he, kind of an example of how he sort of dodged the invitation. This is to Isabella Beecher Hooker, who was actually Beecher will indicate that she is a sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who's much better known than this woman. But anyway, she's invited him to come to a meeting, and he says, I beg you to believe that I'm not insensible to your kind appreciation of what I have done. And I hope in the future to be nonetheless worthy of your goodwill. But, and then he says, he can't come to the meeting because he has to be in the Senate. He says, if I can be in service, let me go, let me know, excuse me. And then he kind of dodged it. And this is the way many of these white leaders would do it. They would support it in name and say, of course, this is important, but they weren't really to show up at some of these women's rights meetings.
Interesting.
Yeah. So and David, I'll just finish by saying David Donald, who's still the best biographer of Charles Sumner, even though the book is quite old at this point. But he said that towards the end, Sumner became more in favor of women's suffrage. Just read a little bit of a letter from Lucy Stone to a friend, and this kind of sums up the attitude that many of the women had towards Sumner. She just said, I wish he, and this is meaning Sumner, felt moved to give our cause the great brave help he rendered to the slave. Nevertheless, we must be forever grateful for what he has done for human rights, even though it does not tell directly for us. She said, hence we see the old abolitionists generally shrink from the van of our movement, though they are in hearty sympathy with it. So she's talking about Sumner, but she's also generalizing that there were many other men who were in the same position. But I just thought that was a nice way of characterizing. That's a long answer to your question, but I think that kind of puts him in the context of many of these reformers after.
That's very interesting. I mean, I guess we can either deduce that he was on the fence, or maybe politically he didn't want to get involved there because he had been so vocal and so forceful with the abolition around slavery. What are your thoughts about that? Your opinion, I guess, from what you've read.
Well, it's, as I said, he sometimes would dodge it. He sometimes was accepting. He always had a grand phrase to say, of course, I'm in favor of equal rights for everybody. I do have one other little scrap of paper that's in my files, and it's quite an interesting note because it's written on a speech that Sumner gave in the Senate, and it was about equal rights. And he was very careful not to say women's rights, but just equal rights. And this was a speech that he gave in 1869. This is, of course, before the passage of the 15th Amendment. But written on this copy of this speech is a statement by Susan B. Anthony And this is way after Sumner was gone. It's 1901, and it's handwritten. It's from the History of Women's Suffrage papers. And she says, Charles Sumner said to me when I asked him to speak for us in 1874, quote, take my speeches, and when I say color or race, but sex, but not sex, then you will have me our strongest argument I can make for women's enfranchisement.
That's
so
very
you want to
interesting.
keep sex out of these speeches and out of the law, which is, of course, it was. And interesting comment from her, and it's a handwritten copy. So
that's interesting. Very interesting. So for me, it sounds like, you know, that he was in support of enfranchisement, but maybe, I don't know, the methods that he was going about it, and also just the fact that he'd been so committed to one cause. I don't know, maybe he didn't want to get mired in that. I don't know.
Yeah.
These are interesting because it's just something I hadn't thought about him. So we'll move away from the advocacy piece for women's rights, and just, I want to know a little bit about his relationship with women in general. Any indication or knowledge about personal relationships with women in his family, and otherwise?
Well, Sumner liked women. It's very clear. He enjoyed their company. And one of the things we tried to do in the letters edition, because it was an opportunity to bring in the voices of women. Of course, in this edition, we don't have the women to him, but in the notes to responding to Sumner, we can bring in their voices. But my take on it, that he liked women who were safe, meaning married women. And there are quite a few letters to the wife of the Republican Senator Hamilton Fish, Julia Fish, and she was in Washington, and she was, some of these women, Frances Seward is another example of a woman. This is the wife of William Henry Seward, the New York senator, and then later Secretary of State in the Lincoln administration. They were more ardent than their husbands. And so he liked corresponding with them, and they obviously catered to him and admired him. And so there are three particular women during the leading up to the Civil War with whom there is a considerable correspondence. And none of these are the women's rights people. These are the wives, you know, who Seward was pretty strong for women's rights, but still didn't try to go to the women's rights meetings and this sort of thing. They stayed in the background. And so three women, one was Frances Seward, as I mentioned. Another one was Fish, Julia Fish. And then a third was Mary Todd Lincoln. Unfortunately, we don't have any letters from Sumner to Mary Todd Lincoln. And I don't know, again, it's one of those frustrating things we were talking about with the Douglas. But in the microfilm edition, there's, well, I wrote down here how many there are from Mary Todd Lincoln, over 20. And sometimes they were probably just invitations to come to teas and events at the White House. But anyway, he was obviously, she thought a lot of him, and they carried on a correspondence, even though we don't know exactly what he said to her. Then after the Civil War, he was quite, again, another lady. Well, she was a widow, but still, I think she was safe. And so this is Anna Cabot Lodge, and this was the very esteemed Boston family. The Lodges, you've maybe heard that story about the Cabots and the Lodges. And so she comes with quite a pretentious name. And so those were the people that he corresponded with, enjoyed their company, and really did not correspond except the correspondence that he has with the women reformers are just all business, like Sandra and Anthony are just, well, yeah, I'll help you get that bill passed or something like that. But they're not many, but there are quite a few to these ladies. Then, of course, there comes the subject of his marriage, which was brief, very brief. And there's been a whole lot of gossip and speculation and so forth. My first speculation about it was why this young woman, 28 years old, she was a widow, had a daughter, why she was attracted to Sumner, who was 55. And what was it about him that made her decide to marry him? He had been a bachelor all his life, was quite set in his ways. And I even asked David Donald, Sumner's biography, this question, and he said, well, you have to remember what Sumner was like after the Civil War. He was riding high. He was the voice of abolition. And then after the Civil War, women, equal rights. And he was a handsome man. He was tall. If you see the pictures, he's got this shock of hair and so forth, very elegant. And so, and she did agree, according to David Donald's biography, and according to just a few letters to him, but she certainly agreed with him about both the emancipation and the voting for the blacks. So anyway, that he wrote a couple of people, including I think Julia Fish, and just said, well, guess what? I'm getting married. And like tomorrow or something like that. So announcing it, and they did get married in October of 1866. And through the later part of 1866 and early 1867, there's references to, we are so happy to have you come, or thank you for the wedding gift, or something like that. And there's no correspondence that we have between the two of them.
Okay.
And except for early on when she was just getting acquainted with him. So very abruptly in June of 1867, think how quickly that was, she left, and they never saw each other again.
Oh, wow.
She took the daughter and she went to Lenox, Massachusetts. And at first he would just say, well, Mrs. Sumner is in Lenox for the summer. And then, of course, that was it. And whether she had it, we just don't know. And there's a lot of speculation. There's some, was the marriage ever consummated? That's another, another subject for a lot of gossip and speculation. Then after a while, when it was clear that she was not coming back and he had to accept that, then he played the victim and said she was a bad woman and she left me and I was on pension, and there's moaning and groaning to some of his buddies about how cruel she was and so forth. These are things we don't know, except that we have the facts. They got married in October of 66, and in June of 67, she was gone. Took the daughter and then off. And whether, she just did it for a while and then she decided she really liked not being in his household, we don't know.
Yeah, that's very short.
Yeah, and it's painful. It's a painful subject.
Very
and
much
clearly so. For him, it was just devastating.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that was very interesting because I wasn't aware either about the details. I just knew he had a short marriage and that was it. You talked a little bit about Lucretia Mott, and you know a lot about her because she published a book of her letters, which you shared. But I wanted to know a little bit, you talked about Susan B. Anthony, and I had a question about what other luminaries, I guess, or women who were active in the movement for women's rights he may have crossed paths with and what that might have been like. And he shared a little bit about that. Tell us about Lucretia Mott, and also if there are other women who were his contemporaries that he, interacted with. I know you shared letters a little bit earlier.
Well, we don't have any correspondence between Lucretia Mott and Charles Sumner. And certainly we know that they probably met. They were certainly, again, before the Civil War, they were all so strongly anti-slavery. Lucretia Mott admired his speeches, and in some of her letters, and I think they probably met. He would go on these lecture tours, and I forget, I think it's in 1855. Yeah, she mentions a lecture he had given in Philadelphia. And I like to think that, you know, afterwards she was able to speak with him. We don't know of his visiting in their home, although she entertained many of the anti-slavery people, and both Black and white.
Right.
She shared Sumner's interest in peace, because you got to remember that his first really famous speech was anti-war, and that was in 1845, excuse me, Grandeur of Nations. And then later, after the Civil War, there's one that he was very pleased about the efforts to end the war between France and Germany. And so she admired that speech. She also in her letters talked about his death, how sad that it was that he died. So clearly there was, from her point, a lot of admiration. From him, no mention. I mean, if you went through all the microfilm reels and you read all the letters, you might find it mentioned. But in the volume the 2 volumes that we edited, we don't have any mention of her. So, but as far as Anthony goes, and you mentioned her, I just wanted to talk about this because this is one of the things that editing can sometimes seem a sort of tedious and boring, some people have used that word, work. And a lot of it is, it's very, you have to be very careful, you transcribing, trying to annotate. But this was a kind of one of the discoveries that we had. There is a letter, a handwritten letter from Charles Sumner at the Huntington Library out in California. And the letter was addressed to Dear Madam. And that's all that the Huntington Library had, just Dear Madam. They didn't know who it was. But as I was reading it, I thought, wonder who that madam is. Well, I looked up and we found a letter from Susan B. Anthony writing Sumner. And this printed letter just matches paragraph by paragraph the letter that she's writing him. So it's clearly an exchange. And I had to do a little bit of work convincing the folks at the Huntington Library that they could now say this letter is not Dear Madam, it's to Susan B. Anthony. But this is 1864. Again, they were all agreed on the emancipation. And she had sent in a petition on behalf of the National Women's Loyal League. And they had sent 100,000 signatures asking for emancipation of all persons of African descent. And he had presented that position to Congress in 1864. And he just says at the beginning, I returned the slip with 1 or 2 corrections. I regretted at the time that the debate on your petition was not reported at length in the New York papers. And her letter says, why didn't this make the headlines in the New York papers? So it's clearly just paragraph by paragraph. It's a real exchange. And that he ends by saying, meanwhile, the work goes on. Slavery is doomed, but much remains to be done, excuse me. And this is March of 1864. So that's one of the few exchanges that we have between Sumner and the well-known women's rights leaders.
Interesting. Excellent. Well, this is very enlightening, and I want to close at this point to learn more about your publication on Lucretia Mott. I think it's just a great opportunity with it being Women's History Month. 2020 kind of got lost in the pandemic, but that was a big year for women's history with the suffrage and everything. So thank you for all of these wonderful notes about Sumner, his perceived attitude toward equal rights. I think it's clear that he was a champion for civil and human rights, and that encompasses.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
can conclude with that, right? But I would like to close so you can share a little bit about your project on Lucretia Mott and who was she, and some of the great findings about her through your work.
Well, one of the things that you had mentioned, Kimberly, was what women's rights activists do you think was like Charles Sumner in that time? So I was pondering various candidates, and I was thinking of the New England people. Lucy Stone was the one I mentioned the letter. She was from New England. She was one of the women who decided, no, let's pass, like Mott, let's get the 15th Amendment passed for Blacks, and then women will come later. Saw that as a very big priority. And then Isabella Hooker, the woman whose letter I quoted earlier, I thought maybe so. And I'd like to say that Mott would have been one like him, but I think there's so many differences. She was a Quaker. She lived very simply. She was well off economically, which was fortunate. Her husband was a very successful, he started off in cotton, and then she and he both decided, no, we are not going to sell cotton because of it's a slave crop. And so he switched to wool and evidently did very well. And of course, she had a large family, very different from the isolated, lonely. He kept selling throughout his life. He says, I'm alone, I'm alone. This is before he got married. Then the marriage broke up, and again, sort of, woe is me, I'm here in this big house all by myself. So there's a lot of self-pity, and I don't think she would have been very sympathetic to that. Then I started thinking about the way that they spoke, and they were both eloquent, but Mott was a Quaker. She never wrote anything out. Everything she said was the spirit moved her.
Wow, she was extemporaneous.
One of the frustrating things when we were editing the speeches in this volume, because if the only things that you find, there's no text, she didn't write things out. So you either have to go to the newspaper reports, or in some of the cases, a stenographer would have been there because she became very, very famous. And so they would write down, and we could deal with what the stenographer did. So it's sort of half newspaper and half stenographer. Now, maybe 1/3 stenographer and half newspapers, because she became very well known. Now, Sumner's speeches, he spent hours preparing them, full of Latin phrases, classical allusions. It was the old-fashioned, 2 or 3 hours, but all very, very carefully prepared. So there's just two striking differences of the way that they reached their audiences, both successfully, but quite different. So I don't really have an answer to, I think I'll go back to my original point about the kind of women that Sumner enjoyed, and he did, and he respected them, and he saw they were, all these women that I mentioned before were intelligent, but these were people who were attached to a man.
Got you. Interesting.
And not the single women, or not the Susan B. Anthony. The letters to her are just all businesslike.
It could have been, the social impact, but it also could have been strategic for him to appeal to the husbands of these women, to, as an influence, for.
Yeah, well, that's one way of getting to the husbands. Yeah,
that's very smart.
Say, well, why can't you get your husband to go on to the, like Seward? He was always impatient with Seward because he thought Seward was too moderate. And he liked his wife. She died very, very, very sadly in 1865. So we don't have anything more. That.
Interesting. But even speaking of that element, this during that time period, the men were the ones who were elevated and who about their voices, but the women were influencing them. And you don't hear that.
Oh yeah.
Record. Yeah. So so that's, I guess that's something too. I'm sure it was strategic. Well,
there's a book that just came out this spring, and I'm sure the author would like this mention, Dorothy Wickenden. She's a writer for the New Yorker, and she wrote a book about, she calls it The Agitators. And it's about three women who all lived in the New York area, Auburn, New York.
Okay.
And she weaves the three together. And one is Frances Seward. And the other is Martha Wright, who was a sister of Lucretia Mott and equally involved in women's rights.
Wow.
And
Okay.
they were very close, Lucretia and her sister Martha. And then the third is Harriet Tubman, because Frances Seward was the one who got the land or the house for Harriet Tubman, so that raised money so that she had a secure place to be. So the book weaves together these three women and using the proximity of New York to talk about, and she calls it the agitator. So that's kind of an interesting.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, this has been very interesting. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us before we close out today?
Well, I think not. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, and having worked on both a man and a woman. Well, I worked on several of the 19th century anti-slavery men, or two anyway. And then after I did Sumner and Stevens, I said I want to work on a woman. And so Lucretia Mott just fit in. And of course, I've had a lot of pleasure dealing with that too. And such a different kind of person than these two men. Yeah.
Sounds like it. I'd like it's interesting to hear about how, transcribing her speeches were a little difficult because of her extemporaneous nature of speaking. So
but I don't think she went on for 3 hours.
No. Well, that's good.
But I said several times in various talks I've given is that we just wish we had a recording.
Yes.
Something about her that's intangible. Just have no idea. She was so persuasive, and there's nothing, I mean, you've got the written word, but there must have been something about her presence. And you hear in some newspaper accounts about how she mesmerized these audiences, and it's just a shame that we can't hear that voice.
Right. That would be amazing.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Beverly. And thank you again, audience, for joining us. We will share titles for further reading if you want to learn more about Lucretia Mott.
Oh, yeah. I'll be happy to answer any questions anybody has.
And also, this is Ask Beverly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Our audience some more. Send in the questions to us at info.sumnerschool@dc.gov. So again, we'll see you next time. Thank you again, Beverly.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thanks a lot, Kimberly.
Absolutely. We'll see you all next time.